pickup truck, a borrowed relic from a Boston friend who still believed the world ran on gasoline and elbow grease, coughed its way down a dirt road that actively resented the passage of anything so modern as a motor vehicle. Jonathan Miller, a man of 38 years who usually navigated the steel and glass canyons of Boston with the quiet precision of an architect, felt the familiar thrum of his urban life fading with every mile of broken asphalt and packed earth. He headed into the heart of rural Vermont, a place he had not willingly visited in almost 2 decades, following the sudden, unceremonious death of his estranged father, Thomas Miller. The early autumn air, thick with the scent of damp leaves and impending decay, pressed in on the truck's rattling shell. Mist, clinging to the ancient maples and gnarled oaks, turned the landscape into a series of spectral, fleeting images. Each one delivered an atmosphere of profound oppression. The town, a blink-and-you'd-miss-it cluster of weather-beaten homes and a general store that had seen better days around the time of the Great Depression, offered no welcome. It was a forgotten place, a sleepy hollow left behind by the relentless march of time, and Jonathan felt a trespasser even before he reached the family home. The road narrowed, trees closing in, branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. And then there it stood, the Miller house. It was not a home. It was a specter from the past. A sprawling 2-story Victorian, it crouched amidst a wilderness of unchecked growth, a monument to a past that stubbornly refused to die. Wild ivy, thick as a man's arm, had swallowed entire sections of the clapboard siding, its tendrils snaking their way up to the very gables. The paint, once a respectable slate gray, had faded to a sickly mottled pallor, peeling in strips that curled like dead skin. Blackened ancient trees, their branches devoid of leaves, stood sentinel around the perimeter, their twisted forms casting long skeletal shadows even in the dim afternoon light. Heavy, wrought-iron gates, rusted almost solid, guarded the entrance to a driveway choked with weeds. Jonathan leaned his full weight against one of them. The metal groaned in protest, before it grudgingly scraped open just wide enough for the truck to pass. The sound echoed in the unnerving silence, a metallic shriek that mocked his effort. As he drove the short distance to the house, he felt a distinct chill, a profound sense of being caught, trapped in a moment long past. The house breathed a sigh of malevolent satisfaction, pulling him into its orbit. Inside, the air hung as a heavy, stagnant shroud, thick with the scent of dust, decay, and something else. A faint, almost metallic tang that Jonathan could not quite place, but which prickled at the back of his throat. Absolute silence pressed in, a palpable weight that muffled his own breathing. Only the occasional protesting creak of old floorboards beneath his feet broke the quiet, like the house itself shifting uneasily, settling deeper into its ancient bones. He felt less an inheritor and more an unwelcome guest, an intruder in his own legacy. The specters of past arguments with his father, of unspoken words that had hardened into a wall between them, hovered in the gloom, their silent accusations thick as the dust motes dancing in the slivers of weak sunlight that pierced the grimy windows. It did not take long for Jonathan to notice the first of the unsettling peculiarities. All the windows on the first floor were not just latched. They were barricaded from the inside with rough-hewn planks of wood, nailed haphazardly but firmly across the frames. The front and back doors, massive oak affairs, were reinforced with sheets of galvanized steel bolted into place, their surfaces scarred and dull. And the security system, a complex array of wires and sensors that looked more suited to a military installation than a rural home, remained utterly silent, its small red indicator lights dark and dead. This was not mere caution, he realized with a creeping unease. This was the work of obsession, a mind consumed by a fear so profound it bordered on madness. Fragments of his own childhood, long buried beneath the concrete of adult life, began to surface, sharp and unsettling. His mother, Evelyn, a woman of gentle disposition, always carried a quiet anxiety, a flicker of fear in her eyes, especially as dusk approached. He recalled hushed, tense conversations between his parents late at night, voices muted to mere whispers, the words themselves indistinguishable but the underlying dread palpable. There were inexplicable curfews, strict prohibitions against being outside after sunset, even in the height of summer, always delivered with an unshakable solemnity that defied childish protest. And more than anything, he remembered the constant prickling sensation of being watched, an unseen presence hovering just beyond the windows, its presence a cold pressure against the glass. He had dismissed it then as the overactive imagination of a lonely boy in an old, isolated house. Now, standing amidst the tangible evidence of his father's paranoia, those memories were premonitions. In the cavernous living room, beneath a thick blanket of dust that muffled the intricate carvings of its dark wood, stood an antique grandfather clock. Its elegant brass pendulum was still, its face frozen. The hands pointed precisely in the morning. Jonathan's blood ran cold. That was the exact time of his father's death, according to the terse details on the death certificate. It was a detail too precise, too chillingly specific for mere coincidence. The house was not just old, it was a keeper of time, marking moments of profound significance with an unnerving accuracy. Despite the profound emptiness, the absolute silence that reigned, Jonathan knew he was not alone. This was not the simple loneliness of a man in an abandoned house. This was something far more ancient, a cold, predatory awareness, something hidden deep within the shadows of the surrounding forest, something primal and patient, simply waited for the old guardian to be gone. Now, with Thomas Miller's last breath exhaled into the pre-dawn air, its unseen gaze shifted. It settled on him, and the feeling, subtle at first, then growing with the suffocating certainty of a coming storm, was pleasure. The air in the house thickened as the days wore on, becoming a heavy syrup that slowed Jonathan's movements and dulled his senses. He tried to focus on the task at hand, sorting through his father's meager belongings, readying the house for sale, but the place fought back, a silent, stubborn resistance. He found his father's study, a room untouched for decades, buried under an avalanche of papers and books. The scent of old paper and dust motes, thick as pollen, hung in the air like a forgotten prayer. The shelves were crammed with volumes on cryptozoology, tales of Bigfoot and Nessie, but also weighty tomes on New England folklore, local legends of witches and spirits and things that went bump in the night. On the margins of these books, and on loose sheets of yellowed legal paper scattered across the desk, Jonathan found strange, spidery handwritten notes, almost indecipherable, scribbled in a hand he recognized as his father's, but more frantic, more urgent than he had ever seen it. They were cryptic, hinting at cycles and disappearances and the turning of the moon, phrases that sparked a faint, unsettling echo deep in Jonathan's mind. Later, Wrestling with a particularly stubborn window that refused to open, he decided to venture into the attic. It was a place of forgotten things, a graveyard of the past, choked with generations of cast-off furniture, dusty blankets, and trunks overflowing with ephemera. The air up there was even heavier, hotter, a stagnant breath held for centuries. Amidst the chaos, tucked away beneath a pile of moth-eaten quilts, his hand brushed against something hard and unyielding. It was an old wooden chest, sturdy despite its age, its surface scarred by time but still robust. Crude, blocky initials MM were deeply carved into the lid, along with a date, 1792. The simplicity of the inscription belied the weight of its antiquity. A shiver, not from cold, traced its way down Jonathan's spine. He knew keenly that he stood on the cusp of something. With a grunt, he wrestled the chest open. The smell that wafted out was a potent blend of old paper, dried ink, and something else. Something vaguely metallic, like dried blood and fear. Inside, neatly stacked and meticulously rolled, were dozens upon dozens of newspaper clippings. They varied in size and print, some on brittle, cream-colored newsprint from the turn of the 20th century, others on thicker, grayer stock from the 1930s and 1940s, all the way up to recent decades. The earliest ones dated back to the early 19th century, a tangible history unfolding before him. He pulled one out at random, its edges crumbling as he unfolded it. The headline, in a stark, bold font, screamed, "Mysterious attacks plague remote settlements. Cattle slaughtered." Another read, "Local man vanishes without a trace in woods near town." A third, from a later era, "Brutal killing shocks community. Unidentified predator blamed." All of them described horrifying events in the quiet, forested regions surrounding the town, and other nearby communities across the state line, tales of monstrous violence and unexplained disappearances. A cold dread began to seep into Jonathan's bones as he continued to sift through the clippings. With growing horror, he noticed a recurring detail, a common thread woven through the fabric of these tragedies. In almost every single article, the Miller surname appeared, not as victims, not once, but always as witnesses, the first to discover the mangled remains of livestock, the mangled bodies of unfortunate travelers, or the baffling absence of a vanished neighbor. They were the ones who assisted the investigation, who provided local knowledge to the sheriff's deputies, yet never offered any concrete explanations, their testimonies always vague, evasive, shrouded in an unsettling ambiguity. It was as if they hovered at the edges of these horrors, always present, never fully implicated, but always there. He began to lay the clippings out on the dusty attic floor, arranging them by date, a macabre timeline unfolding before his eyes. The patterns emerged with chilling clarity. The attacks were not random. They occurred cyclically, often in the same time of year, late autumn, early spring, with unnerving regularity. There were gaps, sometimes years, sometimes decades, but the return was inevitable. A grim cosmic clockwork. This was no string of unfortunate accidents, no mere coincidence of predatory wildlife. This was a deliberate, recurring horror. The vague sense of unease that had shadowed Jonathan since his arrival solidified into a cold, hard obsession. His family, he realized with a sickening lurch in his gut, did not just know more about these events. They were deeply, inextricably involved. Their presence in the old articles was not passive. It was active, deliberate. He had to understand. He had to know what terrifying part his ancestors had played in these cyclical nightmares. Just as he prepared to give up for the night, his eyes, aching from squinting at faded newsprint, landed on a particularly fragile clipping dated 1937. It was an interview with a local historian, lamenting the lost history of the area. Buried within the text, like a buried secret itself, was a fleeting mention of Miller family records stored in the basement, which would shed light on the mystery, but had since become inaccessible. His heart hammered in his chest. A clue, a promise, a horrifying path, leading deeper into the dark heart of his family's legacy. He found his first real lead, a thread pulling him towards a truth he instinctively knew he was about to uncover, a truth he did not want. The basement, dark and silent beneath his feet, now beckoned with the undeniable lure of revelation, a place where the true story at last lay revealed. The newspaper clippings, spread across the attic floor like scattered bones, served as a grim Rosetta Stone, slowly deciphering the strange language of Jonathan's childhood. As he immersed himself in the dated accounts of missing persons and slaughtered livestock, a disturbing mosaic began to form, pulling forgotten memories from the murky depths of his past. He remembered his mother, Evelyn, a woman whose every movement was imbued with a quiet grace, yet whose nightly ritual of checking the locks on every window and door bordered on the manic. Even in the sweltering heat of August, when the air conditioning in the old house struggled and the screens hummed with cicadas, she made her rounds, her fingers tracing the latches, her face a mask of profound, almost religious concentration. He had dismissed it then as a mother's fussiness, a quaint eccentricity. Now he saw the chilling purpose behind it, a desperate nightly warding off of something unspeakable. Then there was his father, Thomas. Jonathan vividly recalled his father's morning routine, a ritual as unshakable as the sunrise. Every single morning, without fail, come rain, snow, or oppressive summer humidity, Thomas shouldered his old hunting rifle and slowly patrolled the perimeter of their property. He walked the tree line, meticulously examining the ground, pausing to peer into the dense undergrowth, his eyes scanning with an unnerving intensity. Jonathan, a boy whose world revolved around comic books and baseball, had always attributed it to his father's military past, a habit ingrained from years of soldiering. He had imagined his father simply reliving old glories, playing at being a sentinel. But with the clippings spread before him, the old rifle was no longer a relic of a past war, but an active participant in a grim present one. It was a ritual of defense, a grim inspection for what exactly? His mind cast further back to the days when his grandfather, Isaac Miller, had still been alive. A silent, stoic presence in the creaking old house. Jonathan remembered snatches of conversations, hushed and tense, between his father and grandfather, overheard from the shadowy landing of the grand staircase. Words like duty uttered with a solemn reverence, legacy spoken with a heavy sigh, sacrifice whispered with a hint of steel, and maintaining balance, a phrase that had then sounded like so much adult nonsense. As a boy, these fragmented utterances had been nothing more than boring adult talk, a backdrop to his own quiet games. Now, those words reverberated in his mind, stripping away their childish innocence and revealing a core of chilling significance. They were not abstract concepts. They were the very foundation of his family's existence. He also remembered his grandfather, Isaac, bent for hours over vast, yellowed maps of the surrounding forests and mountain ranges, tracing lines with a gnarled finger, making tiny, intricate marks in faded ink. Jonathan assumed they marked hunting trails, secret paths to prime fishing spots. He had even, once or twice, begged his grandfather to take him along, only to be met with a stern, unyielding refusal. The memory of those maps, those meticulous markings, now revealed a profoundly sinister hue. They were not charting the pursuit of game, he realized with a sickening jolt. They were charting something far more dangerous, far more deadly. The process of piecing these scattered fragments together felt like fitting shards of broken glass. Each connection, each realization, sent a fresh wave of psychological pressure washing over him. His childhood, which he had always considered relatively normal despite its isolation, was now revealed as something else entirely. It had been permeated by a hidden fear, a pervasive undercurrent of dread that had always been present, lurking just beneath the surface of everyday life. The strange atmosphere of the old house, which he had often dismissed as a product of its age and creaking timbers, was something far more sinister. Even as a child, he had felt its pulse, its own dark aura, and the persistent, chilling sensation of being under constant observation, not by his parents, but by something unseen, something ancient that called this house its own. Every new piece of information, every unearthed clipping, every recontextualized memory, systematically destroyed his comfortable illusions about his family. The Millers were not just eccentric New Englanders, a family of quiet recluses who clung to old ways. They were something else entirely, something far more terrifying. They were keepers, guardians of a dark, age-old secret, a truth so profound and so horrific that it had been woven into the very fabric of their lives, into their every custom and ritual. Jonathan had been blind to it, willfully ignorant, shielded by the mundane routines of his Boston life. But now, in the suffocating silence of that attic, with the weight of generations pressing down on him, the veil was torn away, and what lay beneath was a monstrous reality, one he had never, in his wildest nightmares, even begun to suspect. The house and the woods that cradled it were not merely haunted by spectral presences. They were home to something far more primal, and his family had always known it. The mention of Miller family records stored in the basement in that brittle 1937 newspaper clipping was a match struck in the darkness. It ignited a frantic energy in Jonathan, a need to know that dwarfed all other instincts. He found the basement door, a heavy oak slab at the back of the kitchen, barely visible beneath a thick coat of peeling paint. It groaned open on rusty hinges, exhaling a breath of cold, damp air that smelled of mold, ancient earth, and something else. A faint, almost metallic tang, like old blood and rust. He flicked on his powerful LED flashlight, but the beam struggled against the oppressive gloom, swallowed by the profound darkness that clung to the stone walls. Each creaking wooden step downward echoed in the cavernous space, amplifying the silence, turning it into a living, breathing presence. Fear, cold and sharp, clawed at the back of his throat. The basement was a labyrinth of shadows, filled with forgotten tools, stacks of decaying firewood, and shelves overflowing with dusty, unlabeled jars. Following the rough diagram he had sketched from the faded memory of the old newspaper article, Jonathan navigated the oppressive space, his flashlight beam dancing across ancient cobwebs and the glistening trails of unseen things. Finally, behind what had once been a small, bricked-up wine cellar, its arched entrance, sealed with crude mortar and stone, he found it. Set deep into the rough-hewn granite wall, hidden behind a loose stack of moldering lumber, was a steel container. It was massive, almost 3 feet long, and hermetically sealed, its surface covered in a thick reddish-brown rust that suggested decades, even centuries, of undisturbed slumber. Just like the chest in the attic, the initials MM were crudely etched into its surface, accompanied by a date, this 1/18/03. The continuity, the deliberate anonymity, sent another shiver through him. This was not a random storage unit. This was a generational vault. With considerable effort, Jonathan pried open the heavy lid. The air that rushed out was even colder, drier, carrying with it the scent of old parchment and the faint, acrid tang of forgotten secrets. Inside, stacked in neat, tight bundles, were dozens of old, yellowed parchment maps. They were hand-drawn, painstakingly detailed, depicting the rugged topography of the surrounding forests and mountain ranges, the rolling green mountains of Vermont, the craggy peaks of the White Mountains in New Hampshire. But it was not the meticulous cartography that stole his breath. It was the markings. Each map was covered in a network of red ink, crosses, circles, and an occasional square, all accompanied by precise dates, written in a variety of calligraphic hands, clearly belonging to different generations of millers. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum in the suffocating quiet of the basement. He pulled out the newspaper clippings he had brought with him, his hands trembling as he laid them next to the maps. The horrifying coincidences were immediately apparent, stark and undeniable. Every single red-marked point on these ancient maps corresponded precisely to the location and date of one of the beast attacks or unexplained disappearances he had read about in the newspaper archives. The precise coordinates, the specific dates. They were all there, meticulously documented, a grim chronicle of terror. And then he saw the handwritten comments, scrawled in faded ink on the margins of some of the maps, barely legible, hinting at a truth far more disturbing than mere observation. Moon full, victim chosen, red 1, scrawled in a frantic hand beside a cluster of crosses in a remote valley. Another next to a series of circles tracking a winding path through the pines, pack tracked, path guided. A third, chilling in its brevity and cold calculation, tracks hidden, silence kept. These were not the idle jottings of a curious observer. These were operational notes, the grim instructions of an unseen hand. These maps, Jonathan realized with a sickening lurch, were not mere records of tragedies. They were something far more profound, far more terrifying. They were a detailed schema, a meticulously documented system that the Miller family had employed for centuries. They were not just recording the attacks. They were tracking their movements, predicting their patterns, and influencing their direction. This was not chaos. It was a horrifying, orchestrated order. The final, crushing realization hit Jonathan with the force of a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs. His ancestors, the quiet, eccentric Millers he had always vaguely known, were not mere witnesses to these unspeakable events. They were not victims of circumstance. They were an intrinsic part of something much, much larger. They had not been preventing these horrors. They had been cold-bloodedly tracking them, documenting them, and in some unspoken, unspeakable way, guiding them. The very thought made his stomach churn, a bitter taste rising in his throat. The fear of the unknown was quickly replaced by a more terrifying fear, the certainty of human complicity. And now he, Jonathan Miller, stared into the abyss of that legacy. The sun began its slow, inevitable descent, painting the western sky in hues of bruised purple and dying embers. With each minute that ticked by, Jonathan felt a strange, primal anxiety coalesce in the pit of his stomach. It was not a human fear, not born of logic or reason, but something deeper, an instinctual tremor that pulsed through his very bones. He tried to focus on the notes he had been making, to construct a coherent narrative from the disparate fragments of the diary and maps, but his mind refused to settle. His hearing sharpened. Every rustle of the dry leaves outside, every creak of the old house, sent a jolt through him, making him jump. He found himself, without conscious thought, walking to each window, checking the latches, the heavy bolts, mimicking his mother's long-ago ritual, his fingers tracing the cold metal, a desperate, futile gesture against an unseen enemy. From the dark windows, the world outside transformed. The forest, which had appeared merely dense and shadowed during the day, now presented as an impenetrable wall, a living, breathing entity that pressed in on the house. Within its depths, he felt a gaze, not a human gaze, but something cold, ancient, and undeniably predatory. It was not a figment of his overwrought imagination. It was a tangible, chilling sensation, as if a great silent beast stood just beyond the tree line, its eyes fixed on him, assessing its prey, marking its territory. The air itself grew heavy with anticipation, a suffocating weight that pressed against his chest. Then it came. Deep from the heart of the woods, through the thick, interwoven canopy of skeletal branches, a sound ripped through the stillness. It was a prolonged, soul-chilling howl, not like any wolf he had ever heard, not like any animal indigenous to these quiet New England hills. This was deeper, more guttural, a sound laced with an agonizing, ancient sorrow, yet also with an undeniable hunger. It was too profound, too haunting, too close. It tore through the oppressive silence of the night, raw and untamed, piercing Jonathan's very soul, freezing him in place, every muscle in his body rigid with terror. He pressed his face against the cold glass of the parlor window, peering into the inky blackness. He distinguished nothing, only the vague, shifting outlines of the ancient trees, their forms twisting and writhing in his fevered imagination. The shadows, deep and impenetrable, danced and shifted, taking on grotesque, fleeting shapes. For a heart-stopping moment he saw glowing eyes, massive forms moving stealthily through the undergrowth. His breath hitched in his throat, and a cold sweat beaded on his forehead. The howl repeated, closer this time, echoing off the distant hills, a sound that was both a terrifying summons and an ominous warning. Jonathan felt his mind begin to unravel, caught between the rationale and the utterly unbelievable. His logical architect's brain desperately tried to convince him that it was merely wild animals, perhaps a coyote or some other nocturnal predator. But his primal instinct, the one that had been humming with unease since he had first crossed the threshold of this house, screamed the opposite. This was no ordinary animal. This was something born of nightmare, something that defied the natural order, something that had always been whispered about in the dark corners of humanity's oldest fears. A wave of profound helplessness washed over him. His comfortable urban existence provided no tools, no defenses against a terror so ancient and wild. He frantically scanned the room, searching for anything that could serve as a weapon. His gaze settled on the dimly remembered image of his father's old hunting rifle, tucked away in a dusty closet in the back hall. It offered the only potential defense, a cold, hard promise of protection. But Jonathan had never held a firearm in his life, never fired a shot, and the thought of trying to use it filled him with a fresh wave of despair. What good would it do against that? This night, Jonathan knew with chilling certainty, marked the beginning of a new nightmare, one far more real and terrifying than any he had ever imagined. He stumbled not into a human secret, a family scandal of forgotten misdeeds, but into something ancient and supernatural, a primal force that had slumbered in these woods for centuries. And now, with his father, the old guardian, gone, that monstrous, unseen entity turned its full, unwavering gaze upon him, the newest, most unwitting inheritor of a blood-stained legacy. The house creaked around him, a mournful sigh, as if bracing itself for the horrors to come. Dawn arrived not with the gentle caress of a new day, but with a pale, anemic light, bleeding slowly into the sky as if reluctant to banish the night's terrors. Jonathan emerged from the house onto the front porch, his body aching, his eyes burning from a night spent in a state of hyper-vigilant terror. The air was cool and crisp, a thin layer of dew glittering on the wild grass, but the morning offered no solace, no cleansing relief. The suffocating tension of the night simply morphed, changed form, settling around him like a heavy shroud. His gaze was drawn, as if by an invisible thread, to the ground near the old, sagging shed, a relic that leaned precariously to one side, its timbers gray and weathered. There, on the damp earth, imprinted with terrifying clarity, were enormous paw prints. They were far too large for any normal dog, too wide and heavy for a bear, pressed into the soil with such immense force that the individual claw marks were starkly visible, like sharpened talons dragged through mud. They were fresh, he realized with a sickening lurch, left only a few hours ago, just before the sun's first hesitant light. A morbid compulsion seized him, drawing him toward the shed like a moth to a flame. His heart thudded heavily in his chest as he reached out, his hand trembling, to grasp the cold, rusty handle of the shed door. It groaned open on protesting hinges, echoing the metallic shriek of the front gate, and the smell that wafted out hit him like a physical blow, a potent cocktail of stale wood, earth, and something else, something distinctly wild, feral, and bloody. Inside, chaos reigned. The wooden beams that formed the shed's rudimentary framework were deeply gouged, crisscrossed with long, parallel claw marks, as if something monstrous had thrashed violently, desperately trying to escape its confines. On the dirt floor, amidst scattered tools and garden implements, Jonathan found dark, glistening clots of blood, still wet at their centers, and clumps of stiff, coarse fur, black as pitch. This was no longer the realm of newspaper clippings and cryptic diary entries. This was tangible, irrefutable proof. The evidence of monstrous, predatory existence lay bare before him, horrifying in its immediacy. His hands began to shake uncontrollably, a tremor that ran through his entire body as he surveyed the damage. It had happened mere yards from where he had stood, safe, he had thought, within the walls of the house. The realization was a cold, bitter draft down his throat. The nightmare had not just come to his door. It had come inside, leaving its gruesome signature. Just then, a figure emerged from the morning mist, moving slowly, deliberately, down the overgrown path from the neighboring dilapidated house. It was old Mrs. Harris, a woman Jonathan barely knew, a reclusive figure whose existence had always been a distant peripheral detail. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, etched deep with age and hardship. But in her eyes, Jonathan saw something more profound. A deep sadness, a weariness that stretched back through generations. She was thin, her frame stooped, her movements hesitant, but her gaze was startlingly direct. She looked at Jonathan, her eyes rheumy with age, taking in his pale, drawn face, the wild disarray of his hair. Then her gaze dropped inexorably to the enormous paw prints etched into the damp earth by the shed. She lingered on them for a long moment, her lips pressed into a thin, grim line. Finally, her eyes, filled with an ancient wisdom and a profound, bone-deep fear, rose to meet his once more. "Your father knew when they came out, boy," she rasped, her voice a dry whisper, trembling with a mix of pity and grim resignation. "And now that duty's yours." The words hung in the cool morning air, a chilling prophecy. Jonathan, his mind reeling, tried to question her, to demand an explanation, to grasp at some thread of understanding. But Mrs. Harris merely shook her head, a slow, deliberate movement that spoke of centuries of unspoken truths. She offered no further words, no elaboration, no comfort. She simply turned, her stooped figure slowly dissolving back into the swirling tendrils of morning fog, leaving him utterly alone. She left him with that enigmatic, terrifying phrase, with the gruesome evidence by the shed, and with the chilling truth of a duty he had not known he had inherited. The cold reality of his lineage, of the monstrous legacy that had been thrust upon him, settled in his bones like an inescapable frost. The cryptic words of Mrs. Harris echoed in Jonathan's mind, a tormenting refrain that clawed at the edges of his sanity. "Your father knew when they came out, boy, and now that duty's yours." He stumbled back into the house, feeling raw, exposed, every nerve ending screaming. The need for answers, for any shred of understanding, had become a frantic, burning hunger. He returned to his father's study, a room that now felt less like a memorial and more like a crypt of secrets. Ransacking the overflowing bookshelves, his fingers brushed against something cold and smooth beneath a stack of brittle, leather-bound classics on local history. It was a diary, its cover made of thick, dark leather aged and supple with time. Engraved on the front in elegant, looping script were the initials TM and a date, late 19th century. Not his father, Thomas Miller, but his great-grandfather, another Thomas Miller. The family's grim legacy, he realized, stretched back even further than he had imagined. This was not just a few generations. This was a generational saga, unfolding over centuries. The scent of ancient leather and dried ink filled his nostrils as he opened it. The first pages of the diary were filled with meticulous, almost scholarly observations of local flora and fauna, detailed sketches of native plants and common woodland creatures, written in a clear, if somewhat dense hand. For a moment, Jonathan felt a flicker of relief, a brief respite from the encroaching horror. It was just a naturalist's journal, a benign record of a simpler time. But as he turned the pages, the content began to shift, slowly, inexorably, taking on a darker, more sinister hue. The handwriting became more hurried, the observations less detached, the entries infused with a growing sense of dread and urgency. Jonathan struggled to decipher the cursive, his eyes scanning the faded ink. And as the horrifying truth began to unfold before him, his world shattered. His family, the Millers, for centuries, had not been fighting the werewolves. They had not been protecting the town, not in the way he understood protection. Instead, they had been accompanying their attacks. The word, stark and horrifying, sprang from the page like a viper. Accompanied. Not battled, not thwarted, but observed, followed, even facilitated. Their role, as explicitly detailed in the great-grandfather's increasingly desperate entries, was not one of heroism, but of chilling complicity. They were tasked with fixing the activity of the pack, of documenting their movements and patterns, of hiding the gruesome evidence after the attacks, of meticulously managing the information that seeped out, ensuring that the local populace continued to believe in the myth of wild animal attacks or unfortunate random accidents. They were not heroes, the diary revealed with brutal clarity. They were secret chroniclers, silent observers, and diligent concealers, their hands stained not with blood, but with the chilling complicity of their silence. And the most horrific revelation: they had actively, methodically, guided hunters and unsuspecting travelers into safe zones, knowing full well that the pack, bound by some ancient unspoken agreement, never attacked its keepers. But while they ensured their own safety, they did not intervene in the pack's brutal hunt for others. Their purpose was clear: to ensure the pack never went extinct, but also, crucially, to ensure its existence was never fully revealed to the wider world. They were not merely passive observers. They were active participants in a monstrous, controlled culling, meticulously managing the harvest of human lives for a purpose Jonathan could not yet fathom. Jonathan was utterly devastated, his moral foundations crumbling beneath him like ancient stone. His ancestors, the very people whose blood flowed in his veins, were not the quiet, principled guardians he had vaguely imagined. They were invisible accomplices, the meticulous record-keepers of a monstrous system, maintaining a fragile, bloody balance through generations of silent horror. Every cherished belief, every comforting illusion about his family's integrity was shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. The quiet dignity he had once ascribed to their reclusive nature now twisted into something far more sinister: the cold calculation of a long-standing, horrifying pact. The profound sense of betrayal, of inherited guilt, was overwhelming. He finally understood what the whispers of duty and legacy truly meant, the words he had overheard as a child. This was no heroic mission, no noble calling. This was an age-old curse, a generational damnation, passed down from father to son, an inescapable burden. He found himself caught in a trap, ensnared by a truth so utterly grotesque, so beyond the pale of human morality, that it threatened to consume him whole. The house, once a silent witness, now murmured with the accusations of generations, each one a participant in the horror he had just unearthed. And now, he realized with a profound, bone-chilling certainty, it was his turn to take up the mantle of that unspeakable service. The great-grandfather's diary, a heavy weight in Jonathan's shaking hands, was not merely a chronicle of attacks and concealed evidence. As he delved deeper, the faded script revealed an even more profound and terrifying truth. The werewolves were not simply wild beasts, driven by primal instinct. They were an ancient, intelligent pack, a sentient entity that had inhabited these forests for centuries, long before the first European settlers dared to cut through the old growth. And they had an agreement, a covenant, with the Miller family. The Millers, the diary explained in chilling detail, had been chosen by the pack as intermediaries, their designated keepers of the balance. Their role was a horrifying tightrope walk, to ensure that humanity, in its ignorance and fear, did not discover and utterly eradicate the werewolves, and in turn, to ensure that the werewolves, in their primal hunger, did not fully reveal themselves and completely destroy the isolated human communities that nestled at the forest's edge. It was a symbiotic relationship, born of terror and necessity, a fragile pact enforced by a river of blood. The great-grandfather's entries articulated the grim rationale behind this macabre cooperation. Past attempts by the local populace centuries ago to hunt and exterminate the pack had always resulted in even greater fury, an unleashing of unbridled savagery that led to widespread panic and catastrophic casualties. The Miller family, recognizing the futility of open warfare against a force so ancient and powerful, had chosen what they believed was the lesser evil, a path of controlled sacrifice, a grim compromise for the survival of both sides, human and beast. It was a utilitarian horror, a cold calculation that traded a few lives for the relative safety of the many. The records detailed a meticulously calibrated strategy, a cycle of suffering managed with chilling precision. The pack hunted, primarily targeting people and livestock living on the remote outskirts of settlements, or those who ventured too deeply into their ancient territory. But they never approached the main town itself, never overtly threatened the core human population. This was the unspoken term of the agreement, the fragile truce, provided the Millers continued to perform their role, diverting suspicion, planting false leads for law enforcement, and, most damningly, guiding the pack's prey away from the protected areas. It was a system of controlled, ritualized predation, maintained through generations of deliberate, complicit silence. Jonathan agonized over this information, a torrent of moral revulsion churning in his gut. How could his ancestors have lived with this monstrous secret? How could they have stomached their role as accomplices in countless murders, year after year, century after century? He tried to wrap his mind around it, to reconcile the ordinary faces in the faded family photographs with the horrifying truth of their service. He found himself chillingly beginning to understand. It was not, he realized with a bitter taste in his mouth, an act of pure evil, not in their minds. It was an act of desperation, a grim, self-sacrificing attempt to prevent a far greater catastrophe, to preserve the tenuous existence of their isolated community from utter annihilation. Their faces in the photographs suddenly appeared less composed, more haunted, burdened by a terrible weight. The diary made the consequences of exposure terrifyingly clear. If the existence of the werewolves were ever fully revealed, if their ancient secret was broken, it would inevitably lead to widespread panic, a hysterical witch hunt that would spare no one. It would mean the total destruction of both the pack, driven to a frenzy of self-preservation, and the town itself, which would become a bloody battlefield, a sacrificial pyre. The silence, the complicity, the guided sacrifices. These were the grim prices paid for a fragile peace, a tenuous coexistence. And then, a chilling realization. underscored by his great-grandfather's increasingly frantic entries, pierced through the fog of Jonathan's horror. The full moon, described repeatedly in the diary as the time of the Great Call, the period of heightened activity and intensified hunting, was fast approaching. He had seen the phases marked on the ancient maps, the dates of past tragedies coinciding with the lunar cycle. His father, Thomas, the most recent keeper, was dead. The silence had been broken. The mantle of this unspeakable duty, this ancient, horrifying covenant, now fell squarely upon his shoulders. He, Jonathan Miller, the modern architect from Boston, was now the inheritor of a bloodline steeped in secrets, an unwitting participant in a pact with monsters. And the time for his first grim performance was almost upon him. The sun, a swollen, blood-red orb, finally dipped below the horizon, spilling its dying light across the eastern sky. The color, a violent crimson that bled into bruised purples and deep, inky blues, felt like a deliberate, ominous premonition, a sign painted across the heavens for his eyes alone. Jonathan stood by the parlor window, the very one he had pressed himself against on his first night, feeling a pressure build within him, a strange, internal echo of the deepening twilight. It was the crushing certainty of something inevitable, something ancient, finally rising from its slumber. Every nerve ending in his body thrummed with a terrible, heightened awareness. As soon as full darkness descended, cloaking the landscape in an impenetrable veil, the forest truly came alive. This time, the howling was not a solitary cry, a lone voice tearing at the silence. It was a chorus, a cacophony of deep, guttural sounds, a symphony of primordial hunger that rose from the depths of the woods. It echoed through the valleys and over the ridges, filling the air, vibrating through the very timbers of the old house. The sound, a raw, primeval declaration, made Jonathan's blood run cold, freezing him in place. This was the Great Call, exactly as his great-grandfather had described it, a chilling confirmation that the cycle had begun anew. Then, at the edge of the tree line, directly behind the house, a sudden movement. A large deer, a majestic buck, burst from the shadows. It ran in a wild, desperate panic, its eyes wide and white with an animal terror so profound it was almost visible. It was not running aimlessly. It headed straight toward the house, toward the faint glow of the porch light, as if seeking some impossible refuge in the very heart of human habitation. Jonathan watched, utterly transfixed, a helpless witness to the unfolding drama. In a matter of seconds, 3 massive shadows detached themselves from the deeper darkness of the forest, surging out from behind the fleeing deer. Jonathan barely registered their forms in the gloom, but their sheer bulk, their predatory speed, and most terrifyingly, the burning amber glow of their eyes were unmistakable. These were the werewolves, not phantoms of folklore or distant legends, but real, living, breathing nightmares. Their movements were a fluid, terrifying ballet of power and speed, their immense bodies moving with a grace that belied their size. And they were driving the deer, not merely pursuing it, but herding it, guiding it, directly past the perimeter of his inherited property. It was in that moment, watching the terrifying spectacle unfold, that a chilling realization slammed into Jonathan with the force of a physical blow. His father, Thomas, had always, without fail, left the old, bug-encrusted porch light on every single night, even when no one was expected. Jonathan had always assumed it was a simple habit, a farmer's caution, or a feeble attempt to ward off errant wildlife. Now, he understood. The light did not frighten the creatures away. It served as a marker. It was a beacon, a signal to the pack, announcing the presence of the keepers, identifying the boundaries of their ancient unspoken territory. It was a silent command, a declaration that this particular patch of land was off limits, that the hunt must pass by, that these humans were protected by the covenant. The deer, a blur of desperate motion, vanished into the deeper darkness, its terrified bleats abruptly cut off. The three massive shapes followed, melting back into the impenetrable shadows of the forest, their glowing eyes the last thing to disappear. A profound, terrifying silence descended once more, a quiet that was heavier, more suffocating than any howl. Jonathan stood there trembling, the cold glass pressing against his forehead. The old miller, the previous keeper, was dead. The pact, the ancient covenant, had been tested. The pack had come, they had hunted, and they had passed by. But their proximity, their deliberate passage so close to his home, was not a show of mercy. It was an unmistakable message, a chilling declaration delivered in the language of predator and prey. We know you are here. We are waiting. And the hunt had begun. The weight of his new, terrifying inheritance settled upon him, cold and inescapable. The silence that followed the pack's departure was not a balm, but a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed down on Jonathan. It was a silence filled with unspoken questions, with the weight of expectation. His great-grandfather's diary, lying open on the table, mocked him with its ancient truths. His father's instructions, vague and half-remembered, now appeared chillingly precise. He stumbled through the house, driven by a primal need to arm himself, to grasp at some vestige of control. His hands, still trembling from the raw terror of witnessing the hunt, finally closed around the smooth, cold stock of his father's old rifle. It was heavy, worn, smelling of gun oil and disuse, a tool of protection and, he now knew, of complicity. The very touch of the cold metal felt like a betrayal, a final surrender to a destiny he had fought, unknowingly his entire life. Driven by a surge of pure, unadulterated fear, a primitive instinct for self-preservation that overrode all reason, Jonathan fumbled with the rifle. He remembered seeing his father clean it, knew vaguely how the cartridges loaded. With clumsy, desperate movements, he slid a few into the chamber, the click a deafening sound in the oppressive quiet. He moved to the nearest window, not the parlor this time, but a small, boarded-up one in the kitchen, forcing a narrow gap between the planks. He raised the rifle, aiming it blindly into the impenetrable darkness where he had last seen the massive, retreating shadows. He was ready. He was ready to shoot, ready to scream, ready to shatter the silence, ready to break any ancient covenant, to unleash whatever fury lay dormant in these woods, just to survive. But the werewolves did not come. They did not rush the house, did not batter at the doors, did not attempt to splinter the reinforced windows. Instead, they reappeared, not directly in front of him, but at the periphery of his vision, their massive forms coalescing from the shadows of the deeper forest. Their eyes, those terrifying amber lights, glowed steadily in the gloom, fixed on the house, fixed, he knew, on him. Their low growls, a deep rumbling sound that vibrated through the very earth, were not aggressive. They were a question, a threat, a test. Jonathan lowered the rifle, his arms aching, his resolve wavering. He knew with horrifying certainty that firing a shot was utterly futile. They had not approached directly because they did not want to. They were not here for a physical confrontation, not yet. They were here to observe, to watch his reaction, to assess whether he would accept his role, whether he would step into the terrifying shoes of the keeper. The rifle, a symbol of human resistance, felt absurdly small, hopelessly inadequate against the ancient intelligence that now watched him from the shadows. This was not a physical battle, he realized, but a profoundly psychological one. They were not demanding his life, not in this moment. They were demanding something far more profound: his submission, his silence, his complicity. They were testing his will, his resolve, his capacity to become the new guardian of their monstrous secret, the new link in their ancient chain. Every fiber of his being screamed in protest, a visceral repulsion against the very idea. An agonizing internal struggle raged within him. One part, the rational, moral part, screamed to pull the trigger, to alert the world, to tear down the veil of secrecy and expose the horror to the cleansing light of human knowledge. Consequences be damned. Another part, deeper, more ancient, soaked in the terror and the legacy of his family, understood the brutal truth. It would only lead to more blood, more death, a wider, uncontained carnage that would engulf the town, consuming innocent and complicit alike. The diary's words, his great-grandfather's desperate reasoning, rang in his ears. Controlled sacrifice for survival. The weight of generations of calculated horror pressed down on him, silencing the screams of his conscience. With the first hint of gray light in the eastern sky, the werewolves began to recede, their forms dissolving back into the swirling mists that now clung to the forest floor. They did not run. They simply faded, like shadows summoned by the night and banished by the dawn. Jonathan slowly lowered the rifle, its weight suddenly unbearable. His hands were weak, clammy, his entire body trembling with exhaustion and a profound bone-deep terror. He hoped desperately that his refusal to engage, his terrified inaction, appeased them. But deep down, in that primal, instinctual part of his mind, he knew better. This was merely a respite, a pause. The trial was not over. It had just begun. And the next test would be far more demanding. When the first weak rays of morning light began to pierce the lingering mist, casting long, distorted shadows across the dew-soaked landscape, Jonathan found himself compelled to move. His terror had not subsided, but it had transmuted, morphing into a grim, almost suicidal curiosity. He had to know. He had to understand. He had to follow the tracks, the enormous paw prints that still marred the damp earth, a stark testament to the night's horrors. It was no longer a matter of fear, but of an obsessive need to confront the truth, to walk the path his ancestors had trod. The tracks led him deep into the forest, away from the relative safety of the house, away from the familiar paths. The woods here were ancient, dense, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The mighty hemlocks and towering pines whispered secrets to each other, their branches interwoven into a cathedral of shadows. After what felt like miles of treacherous going, scrambling over roots and pushing through thorny undergrowth, the tracks led him to a clearing, and there, almost completely swallowed by moss and the relentless march of time, was an old stone fence. It was not a typical farmer's wall, but a structure of rough-hewn granite blocks, too old, too sturdy, too deliberately placed to function as a mere property boundary. This was a threshold, a demarcation line leading into a sacred, forgotten place. With a profound sense of foreboding, Jonathan pushed his way through a gap in the crumbling stone. Beyond the fence, nestled within the dense, encircling trees, he discovered a small, utterly neglected cemetery. It was the Miller family graveyard, a resting place so ancient and overgrown it had been forgotten by the living. Headstones, some toppled and broken, others leaning precariously, were cloaked in thick blankets of emerald moss, their inscriptions barely legible. He moved among them, brushing away the verdant shroud, revealing the names of his ancestors, his own lineage stretching back into the silent earth. Dates of birth, dates of death. Thomas Miller, Isaac Miller, generations of Millers. But etched beneath the names and dates on almost every single stone were strange repeating inscriptions, phrases carved with a deliberate, chilling permanence. Servant, overseer, keeper of balance. The very words from his great-grandfather's diary, the ones that had so profoundly unsettled him, were now chiseled into the cold stone, an undeniable confirmation of the grim truth. This was not just a family burial ground. It was a testament, a monument to a terrible, age-old compact. Suddenly, a shift in the deep shadows of the ancient firs at the edge of the cemetery. Jonathan froze, every muscle tensed, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. One of them emerged. It was massive, even larger than he had imagined from the fleeting glimpses of the night before. Its powerful form covered in fur the color of deep, starless night. Its eyes, those terrifying pools of amber light, glowed with an unnerving intensity, fixed directly on him. Jonathan expected an attack, a brutal, swift end to his terrified journey, a final bloody punctuation mark on the generations of his family's complicity. But the creature did not attack. It moved slowly, deliberately, its massive paws making no sound on the soft, damp earth. It approached him, stopping only a few steps away, its glowing eyes unwavering. Jonathan felt the heat radiating from its immense body, smelled the wild, earthy scent of its fur. He braced himself, closing his eyes instinctively, waiting for the tearing claws, the crushing jaws. But instead, to his profound shock, the monster slowly lowered itself, bending its powerful forelegs, sinking to its knees. Its huge lupine head bowed, its gaze still fixed on him, but now distinctly different, no longer overtly predatory. It was not an act of aggression. It was an act of recognition, an acknowledgement. In that moment, standing in the silent, moss-covered cemetery surrounded by the stones of his ancestors, Jonathan understood everything. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying, absolute clarity. The Millers had never been enemies of the werewolves. They had never been mere victims. They were, and always had been, an intrinsic part of something far, far greater, an ancient symbiosis rooted in blood and fear. Their age-old duty, passed down through generations, was not to fight or to protect, but to cooperate, to serve. His family had served not humanity, not the isolated townsfolk, but the pack. And now, as the monstrous creature knelt before him, bowing its head in silent deference, the truth settled upon Jonathan, cold and heavy as a tombstone. He was the next in line. He was the new keeper. The truth, when it finally settled upon Jonathan, was a stunning blow, both horrifying and strangely illuminating. There was no going back, no possibility of refusal. He knew with a certainty that resonated through the ancient bones of his family that to reject this monstrous inheritance would be to unleash the pack's full, unbridled fury upon the town. There would be no more measured sacrifices, no more controlled hunts. The covenant, broken by his refusal, would dissolve, and the quiet community, ignorant of the ancient forces that protected it, would become a bloodbath. His father, Thomas Miller, had known this. He had lived with this terrible knowledge, and in the end, he had accepted his grim fate. Now, the torch, burning with a cold and terrible flame, had passed to Jonathan. He walked slowly back to the house, his steps heavy, each one an acknowledgement of his new, inescapable reality. He looked at the boarded-up windows, the reinforced doors, not as symbols of his father's paranoia, but as essential boundaries. They were no longer meant for protection from the dark world outside, but rather as markers, a defined line between his human existence and the ancient, terrifying world he was now sworn to guard. The house, once a suffocating prison of secrets, was now transformed into a fortress, a central node in the web of the covenant. He found the hammer and the stacks of rough-hewn planks in the shed, exactly where his father had left them. His hands, though still trembling, moved with a new, grim purpose. One by one, he began to nail the boards across the remaining unfortified windows, the rhythmic thudding of the hammer echoing in the silent house. This was no longer an act born of fear, a frantic scramble for safety. This was a ritual, a profound, solemn confirmation of his acceptance of the keeper's role. Each nail driven home was a pact renewed, a silent vow to continue the legacy of his bloodline, to serve the ancient, terrible balance. He then returned to his father's study, where the worn, leather-bound diary lay open on the desk. His hand, which had trembled uncontrollably just hours before, now found a strange, unsettling firmness. He picked up his father's pen, its nib stiff with dried ink, and carefully dated the last empty page. Then, with a breath held tight in his chest, he wrote the words, simple yet freighted with the weight of centuries. October 1st. First night. I accepted. He placed the period, a final, unyielding mark, then slowly, deliberately closed the diary. It was not an end, but a ceiling. A new chapter in an ancient history. This was the beginning of his new life, a terrifying existence bound by an unspeakable pact, a quiet damnation that stretched into the unknown future. The ordinary world, the one he had inhabited just days ago, felt impossibly distant, a fading dream. Outside, as the last vestiges of twilight gave way to the deep star-studded blackness of night, a long, powerful howl rose from the depths of the forest. It was not a solitary cry this time, nor a chorus of hunger. It was a single, resonant call, full of a strange, ancient wisdom, an acknowledgement of his oath. But this time, Jonathan was not afraid. He stood by the window, not pressing against the glass in terror, but standing tall, listening. He listened to the sound not as a man fearing a monster, but as a new member of an ancient covenant, as a human inextricably bound to the wild heart of this world. The grim realization settled over him, cold and absolute, and it was not just his own. It was the crushing understanding that his family, for generations beyond counting, had never fought the encroaching darkness. They had not been heroes, nor had they been victims. They had been its keepers, its silent custodians, its unwilling servants. And now, Jonathan Miller, an ordinary man plucked from his ordinary life, stood guard over this horror. the new bridge between the fragile world of humanity and the ancient, brutal world of shadows, doomed to an eternal silence and an eternal terrifying service. The hunt would continue, and he, the keeper, would watch, and he would enable until his own turn came.